Hey there, welcome to this episode of Speaking of. Today I want to speak about the Oregon Death with Dignity law. If you are not from Oregon, uh, the Death with Dignity law is a law that allows physicians to prescribe life-ending medication to terminally ill patients. This Currently, as our legislature is in session, there are a couple of bills that are working their way through both the House and the Senate that are aimed to modify the law as it's currently written. And I'll get into a little bit of that in just a moment. But first, a little bit of history. If you are interested, if you don't live in Oregon, perhaps you would be interested in knowing a little bit about the background. The law was first approved actually by Oregon voters in 1994, and so almost 30 years ago. But the federal government intervened. The federal government actually sued the Oregon government to prevent the law from going into practice, and there was a lot of back and forth in the courts for quite some time. In I think it was something like 96 or 97, the measure was put to Oregon voters a second time, and this time they actually approved the measure in an even greater margin. And so the law did go into effect fully, I think, in 2006. That's when it finally, I think it was being practiced prior to that, but the Supreme Court of the United States finally decided that the law was constitutional, and so the law was allowed to stand. Um, a little bit of clarification, because sometimes when people hear about physician-assisted suicide or death with dignity, they assume that it just means that anybody who wishes may choose to take medication that ends their life, and that's not how the law in Oregon is written. By the way, there's no federal law on this. Currently, there's only a handful of states that permit um, physician-assisted suicide, but the states that permit it, the way that what it means is that there's actually something like 1 in 6 people in the United States live in a state that does permit this, and so there's a lot of people who could have access to this if they chose. But it's a state matter. It's a matter that is decided by the state, and there are very stringent requirements in order to access the death with dignity. In Oregon, currently those requirements include a number of things. First of all, a person must be a resident of Oregon. That is, that you cannot live outside of the state and come to Oregon in order to seek this medication. The death must be imminent. That is to say that it can't be something that's going to be. I think it's 6 months or less, and so it can't be something that you're just diagnosed with an illness and you likely have 2 to 4 more years left or something like that. It must be within a fairly small window of time, and there is a 15-day waiting period. That meant that there'd be a 2-week span, or a little over 2 weeks, from when the medication was prescribed to the time when the medication could be, the prescription could be fulfilled. Now, that requirement was actually waived by our former governor, Governor Kate Brown, in 2019. She issued an executive order that removed that requirement, and in 2020, that change, or that modification, went into effect, which means that there is now no 2-week or 15-day waiting period. A little bit of just kind of some statistics and some numbers. The report, every year the Oregon Health Authority issues a report on who is using the law, who is being prescribed the medication, how many people die using the prescriptions, and so on. Last year, in 2022, so this report just came out 1 week ago, on March 8th. It gave the numbers for the year 2022. Last year, there were 431 people who received the prescription for one of the life-ending medications. And of that 431 people, 278 people died using the medication, and that includes 23 people here in Marion County. Now, that means that there are a number of people who receive the prescription but don't die, or they choose not to have the prescription filled. Um, there are differing reasons that explain that gap, but by and large, the number, it might also mean that they receive a prescription and then they pass away before they're able to take the medication. So that explains why 278 people die while 431 receive the medication from that. An interesting little observation in the report that was just issued. This report indicated that there were 32 people who received prescriptions who died, but they'd received the prescription in a previous year. And so that means they might have been prescribed in 2021 and died in 2022. Now, the simplest explanation for that is that they received the medication in the latter half of 2021 and filled it or passed away in the early part of 2022. But that number caught my eye because I wonder if it means that people are receiving a prescription, months or even years prior, and they're not actually taking it till later. And if that's the case, that would seem to be a violation of the principle of the law, which says that the death of a person taking the medication is supposed to be imminent. If it's supposed to be imminent, how did they take a medication, or how were they prescribed a medication that far in advance of them actually dying from it? Which I don't have the answer for that, and there's possibly an explanation for it, but I noticed that, and I was curious about that. I think it suggests that there's something worth looking at there. Now, of the people who did take the prescription and pass away from it, 85% of them are 65 and older. There is a small number of people, I think there was one individual who was between the ages of something like 18 and 34, and a small handful, like 5 or 6, that were between 35 and 44. So the majority of people are older. They're 65 and older. The top 3 reasons for the top 3 illnesses that would lead to a person taking the medication are in order: cancer, heart disease, and then neurological conditions. So there's a range of cancers: pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, and that are pretty high up on the list. And then heart disease, heart conditions, and then neurological conditions like ALS or other such debilitating neurological conditions. What's interesting to me is that the number when you look at the trajectory from when the law went into effect and from when physicians were able to prescribe the medication until today, I think there's something rather telling there. The number has gone up really considerably, especially in recent years. So the first year that the medication was able to be prescribed, there were 24 prescriptions written and 16 people who died from the illness. That was in 1998. In 2022, again, the numbers: 278 people died from, and 431 prescriptions were written. So if you put that on a chart, you see that's a pretty steep climb. And even if you compare 2022 to 2021, that too is also a sharp climb. So there were from 384 prescriptions to 431 prescriptions from one year to the next. So that's like a climb of 45 people in just 1 year that are being prescribed the medication. So that indicates that this is something that is not on the decline at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems to be on a very sharp incline for the number of people who are taking the medication. Now, why is this an issue for us today? What would precipitate doing a video on this topic? There are 2 bills that are making their way right now through the Oregon legislature. One of them in the House and one of them in the Senate. Essentially, without going into too much detail, they are a response to a settlement that the Justice Department of Oregon reached with. They were being sued by an individual who wanted the residency requirement dropped. And so as part of that settlement, the Justice Department agreed to introduce an amendment to the law that would allow this that requirement, the residency requirement, to be dropped. And so this didn't come out of thin air. It came out as a response to this lawsuit that was brought and then settled. And as part of that settlement, the legislature agreed to introduce a modification of the law. And so two bills are going through, again, one through the House, one through the Senate, and the process of reconciliation will eventually bring those together. They are, if you are interested, they are House Bill 2279 and then Senate Bill 891. And both of them, the primary focus, they actually make a number of like smaller and less significant changes, but the primary focus here, the primary effort is to drop that residency requirement. So that means that Oregon would be a place where people can travel from out of state in order to avail themselves of this medication. So you won't need to prove Oregon residency in order to receive the treatment. A couple of other little changes as part of the law as well. First of all, physicians' assistants and nurse practitioners would also be allowed to prescribe the medication. Currently, you have to be an MD in order to prescribe the medication, but under this expansion, PAs and nurse practitioners would also have the ability to prescribe the medication. And then the waiting period is reduced. I think what that's essentially doing is it's codifying into law what the executive order of 2019 said. And so essentially the thrust of this is that the law is being expanded. It's being enlarged so that it will be easier to access it, and it will be easier for more people to access it. And I think, I mean, my prediction is that sharp trend upward if this bill becomes law, that sharp trend upward will only increase. I think we'll see, of course, more and more people who then take advantage of this, and if you can call it that, they'll avail themselves of these medications in order to end life. What are some thoughts on this? How do we as Christians evaluate this? Well, a couple of things. First of all, we need to be really clear on what it is that we are talking about. When we talk about death with dignity or physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, there are actually differences between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. I'm not going to get into those right now, but what I do want to highlight is that there's a difference between being an active and a passive participant in the process of dying. Sometimes as Christians, we are so committed to the principle of life and the value of life that we believe, I think mistakenly, that life must that life you always have to provide treatment for a person, even when they are clearly they've reached a point where their illness is terminal or there's really nothing more they can do. So here's what I mean. I have talked to people over the years who have been diagnosed with cancer, and they are told by the doctors that they can receive chemotherapy or radiation treatment or other forms of treatment, and it might extend their life by a month or 2 or 3, and the side effects will be really, really horrible. And sometimes people of faith, Christian people, feel a conviction that they must seek that treatment, and they must do everything in their power to live longer. And I am of the opinion that that's not necessarily so. I believe that there is a point where Christians can acknowledge the reality of death and dying, and it becomes appropriate to stop medical intervention. Now, that's sort of a very broad statement. I think there are times when, you always have to weigh that out. When is that time come? How do you go about that? But I think it is appropriate, and I think there are times where we can recognize and acknowledge the realities of illness, and that a person is not going to recover, and that I think there is value in allowing a person then to live out their days in comfort. And I think, by the way, this is why hospice care and palliative care are so valuable, and they provide such a valuable service to our communities, because they help people to be comfortable. They help people to face and confront the realities of death. And so I think that's not what we're talking about. So that's sort of a different category. What we are talking about here is um, taking active steps to end a person's life, so that a person, when you prescribe a medication, and what actually takes their life then is not the cancer, it's not the ALS, it's not the, heart disease or whatever, but it's actually the chemical that is introduced into the person's system, the barbiturate that actually then becomes the means of death. And that is what we are speaking of here. I think to really get at how do we as Christians, how do we evaluate this, I think it's helpful to look at the reasons why people choose to seek out medical intervention in ending their life. I was actually really surprised by this. I thought for sure the answer would have been because they want to avoid pain. They're facing a very painful and slow death, and they want to speed the process along. But it turns out that is not that's not among the main reasons. It is on the list, but it's pretty far down the list, actually. The first reason on the list is that a person who is nearing the end of their life they fear losing a meaningful life. Now, the assumption underneath that is that suffering and sickness equals a loss of purpose. That a suffering life is a meaningless life or a purposeless life. And I think that's an assumption I'm going to challenge more in a little bit. But that's the first reason why a person would seek this treatment. The second is they fear a loss of autonomy. And of course, you can see that when a person becomes terminally ill and they begin to lose control over their bodies, they begin to lose control. They're not able to do for themselves what they once did. They become dependent on other people. Again, the assumption underneath this is that human beings are completely autonomous, or we ought to be autonomous. We ought to be in complete control of our life, when we die, how we live. The assumption is that we are autonomous beings, and it should be that way, and therefore we should have a say in when and how we end our lives and when our lives begins. It puts us in the position of authority. And then finally, the third major reason here is a fear of losing dignity. And I think that makes some sense, because I think if you've ever been with a person who is growing ill or weak, or nearing death, it's not that there's no dignity about that, but it's that death is an intrusion, and death is a terrible reality to face. It's a terrible experience, and to watch a loved one die is agonizing. And one of the things that people say is, they say, well, that's not really my mom, that's not how she was, or that's not really my dad or how he was. And I think what they're trying to communicate is this fact that people going through the experience of death are losing something of who they are. And it's kind of this acknowledgement that death is not befitting for us. So what do we say about all of that? Well, I think first of all, I think we ought to note that there's a concern. I think from a very practical point of view for Christians, we ought to be concerned about this creep that takes place. Meaning, what started as a very narrow and very restrictive thing was slowly over time it was expanded, and now the rules are being expanded again in order to open access to a larger number of people, and to make it easier for that large number of people to gain access to this. So it started off, you have to be terminally ill within 15 days of dying, or a 15-day waiting period within 6 months of dying. And then it's, well, there's no more waiting period, and death being imminent is not quite the same thing anymore, and it's not just doctors, and so it slowly expands. What about when a person just simply decides that they don't like to live anymore, that they want to make the decision that life has no purpose any longer, and therefore we ought to permit that? That might sound rather outlandish, but there are places in the world, there are other countries that have legalized death with dignity, and they do it in a way that actually opens the door for these sorts of things. And so, from a very practical point of view, Christians ought to ask themselves, where is this headed? And to what extent should we allow this to continue? But to some of those underlying causes, I think, what do Christians say? I think, first of all, I think we acknowledge that indeed, when we think about death being undignified, I think we can acknowledge and we can agree with people that death is an ugly intrusion into this world. Death is not what this world was supposed to have. It was not supposed to be a part of this good creation. And so we can affirm that death is an intrusion. But here's the thing. The idea that a person can simply consume a pill or be administered some kind of medication and then die a peaceful death, I think that's an illusion. I think no barbiturate in the world can smooth over the ugly and awful reality of death. And of course, as Christians, we would maintain that we have a better focus or a better perspective on death, which is that death is a defeated enemy. And so it is undignified, but it's also conquered. There's hope, and that, I think, ought to give Christians strength and encouragement in facing death. And it's a message that I think we can hold out before the world. The second thing is that when we look at those reasons that people have for seeking end-of-life treatment, one of the assumptions is that you're losing when you're suffering, there's no purpose in that, there's no meaning in that, that a meaningful life cannot be a life that has suffering, and the Christian gospel actually opposes that. The Christian gospel challenges that very assumption. The Christian gospel says that actually suffering does have meaning and it does have purpose. There's meaning in enduring and persevering through suffering and bearing up in the midst of suffering. There's meaning in the sense that when we suffer, we are actually identifying with Christ. We are actually sharing in his sufferings. We are participating with him. So we would reject the idea and the notion that that a suffering life is no longer a meaningful life. It's no longer a life where a person can get enjoyment and purpose out of it. We would say that as awful as suffering is, and it's not something we seek out, but we would still maintain that that there's meaning in that. Because Christ is present in our sufferings. He is with us. He intends to shore us up and strengthen us in the midst of our suffering. Third point on this is the idea that we are autonomous, that we are captain of our own fate, as it were, and that we should have the authority to decide for ourselves the date and means of our death. Paul writes about this in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 14, Paul actually says, whether we live or die, if we live, we live to the Lord. If we die, we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. We are not autonomous. The whole point of the Christian gospel is that we are not our own. To quote the words of the Heidelberg Catechism, we are not our own. We've been bought with a price. Therefore, we belong body and soul to Jesus Christ. Our lives are entrusted into his care. And that's a far better place for them to be. It's far better to entrust ourselves to him, to surrender ourselves to him, rather than to seek to be autonomous over our own lives. And then finally, the fear or the concern about being about the loss of dignity, and there's sort of a sense of when you suffer, you do become reliant on other people, and some of that is it represents a difficult reality. You lose control over your bodily functions. You become ill. You become dependent on them to feed you and to care for you, and so on and so forth. And there are people that don't want to be a burden. They don't want to impose that on someone else. And I think that's a fair concern. That's an understandable concern. But again, as Christians, we would counter that by saying the church is called to be that community, and the church is called to become that place in which brothers and sisters are caring for one another, which church members are ministering to the sick and caring for the infirm, and expressing that Christ-like love within the context of a broader community. And that in doing that, that actually ministers to those who are facing death, and it ministers to those who are experiencing sickness and suffering and adversity. And in so doing, you become the presence of Christ in the midst of pain and even death itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time here when we are speaking of the next issue.